Thank you for that very kind introduction, Angus, and can I also just add my thanks to Jonathan Phillips also for his introduction and to Ian Archer for putting this event on. It's all too rare that one has the chance to address a meeting about 19th century intellectual history, and I'm very grateful, certainly, for this opportunity. So, 5 years before the foundation of this great college, John Henry Newman resolved, after the revival of their once plentiful correspondence, to pay an unannounced visit to John Keble at his vicarage at Hursley in Hampshire. Taken aback by Newman's unexpected appearance at his front door at noon on 12 September 1865, the first meeting between them since Newman's conversion to Roman Catholicism some 20 years previously, Keble explained that, unbeknownst to his visitor, Edward Bouverie Pusey, the third man in the Tractarian triumvirate and Oxford's Regius Professor of Hebrew, was already staying as his guest. Newman crossed the threshold regardless, but the intelligence added awkwardness to what was already a difficult meeting. During his youth at Oxford, Newman had developed an intense admiration for Keble, a fellow of Oriel College some 9 years his senior. Newman's relations with Pusey, the last of the three to arrive at Oriel, and the last to contribute to the Tracts for the Times, had always been different and even quite distant. Newman's letters to Pusey could be abrupt, and those about Pusey even cutting. After the three men had spent some hours conversing, the difference in Newman's estimation of his two friends and former allies found expression in a letter which Newman dispatched to his companion and fellow Oratorian, Ambrose St. John. Of Pusey, Newman wrote that, "I recollect him short and small, with a round head, smallish features. But now his head and his features are half as large again. His chest is very broad, don't say all this, and he has, I think, a paunch." Keble, however, was, as Newman related, as delightful as ever, and it seemed to me as if he felt a sympathy and intimacy with me, which he did not find with Pusey. Newman's report betokens not solely the complex emotional dynamics which drove the Oxford movement in its heyday from 1833 to 1845, but also Newman's and Keble's strong intellectual fellow feeling. These sympathies survived the separation between their respective religious paths, but nevertheless always contained elements of grit which chafed against and ultimately broke down their early bond. In my talk this morning, I'd like to compare and also distinguish between Newman's and Keble's intellectual sensibilities in order to draw out Keble's distinctiveness. Where Newman is remembered as the preeminent philosopher of the Oxford movement and the wider 19th century English Catholic revival, Keble is today chiefly known as their poet. After the extraordinary success of his 1827 cycle of poems, The Christian Year, which have already been mentioned, and his 1833 assize sermon on national apostasy, an event which Newman always regarded as the starting date of the Oxford movement, we tend to think of Keble as having gradually withdrawn from controversy into a life of undemonstrative priestly service and dutiful domesticity at Hursley until his death in 1866. It was an image that Keble himself cultivated, and which, as Simon Skinner will, I think, expand upon later, his admirers reinforced. When Archdeacon Edward Churton, preaching in Keble's memory at Oxford University Church, grew lyrical over the deceased's duteous pastoral care, his humility and playful simplicity, and even what Churton called his primitive manners and somewhat rustic plainness of conversation, he gave voice to the pointedly unintellectual vision of Keble which we have received from those days. In reality, however, Keble's sermons, polemics, and poems, as well as his more extended scholarly projects, which issued in a fairly steady stream from his pen, can be seen to have expressed a consistently learned approach to religious apologetic, albeit also a profoundly conservative one. When read alongside one another, they can take us to the heart of the Tractarian frame of mind and the potential tensions within it. Pusey's Tractarian writings often possessed relatively, not always, but relatively more, of a technical and scholarly character. Keble and Newman, in contrast, placed a more affective emphasis on the interconnections between poetry, philosophy, and history, in intellectually undergirding their campaign to return the Church of England to what they likewise saw as the full apostolicity embodied in the early Church. Seeking, in common with so many other reactionary religious movements across early 19th century Europe and America, to reassert the authority of a pure religious tradition against a corrupt and fallen modernity, Tractarians thus elevated the authority of history as the proper sphere of religious debate. Here I'd like especially to draw out the ways in which poetic and philosophical ideas informed Keble's and Newman's conceptions of history, and then to ask why their different approaches to the past informed their contrasting responses to their 19th century present. Whilst the intensification of Keble's and Newman's engagement with history was a feature of the 1820s and 1830s, equipping the Oxford movement with its dogmatic arsenal, this historical turn drew upon preceding intellectual and cultural currents. Serious-minded undergraduates at the Oxford at which Keble matriculated in 1807 and Newman in 1817 could not fail to encounter two intellectual forces in particular, which in due course would inspire the Oxford movement, and the ways in which its representatives themselves thought about church tradition and history. Although I do not wish to stray too far into the territory through which Elizabeth Jay will shortly guide us, the first of these, which lay outside the formal university syllabus, was the poetry of the Romantic era. Sir John Coleridge, a nephew of Samuel Taylor, and an undergraduate contemporary of Keble's at Corpus Christi College, later recalled with pride how it was he who first introduced his friend to the works of Coleridge and William Wordsworth. In the lectures which he delivered as Oxford Professor of Poetry between 1832 and 1841, Keble argued that poetry was a divine gift which enabled mankind to express religious emotion through controlled rhythm, thus affording what he called a modest reserve and shrinking from publicity, suitable to the sacredness of its object. Newman thought similarly, approving of Keble's contemporaneous project of translating the Psalms into English verse on the grounds that it was seemly to render their original expressions of what Newman saw as Oriental religious feeling into a metered form more suitable to Northern reserve. With their implied rejection of disorderly evangelical enthusiasm and their related deprecation of the authority of prideful inquiry and public opinion in sacred questions, Newman and Keble claimed the very essence of poetry for the project of high church proselytism. When they sought to revivify the church of the early Christian fathers, they would do so in terms that gave voice to the supposed poetry of church history. The second notable element of the Oxford climate was the integration of moral philosophy and philosophical theology effected in Bishop Joseph Butler's 1736 Analogy of Religion. Butler's philosophy came to be widely taught in Oxford under the examination statutes of 1800. It sought to demonstrate the reasonableness of Christianity, not by rationalist deductions from first principles or pretended logical inferences from nature, but rather probabilistically, on the grounds that analogies from moral and natural experience made the claims of revelation more agreeable to reason than its denial. The implications of Butler's philosophy, as Jane Garnett has made clear, generated energetic debate throughout the century, and Keble and Newman both, albeit in different ways, remained attached to it. Contemporaries rightly interpreted Keble's Christian year as suffused with Butler's principles, which blended with his own philosophy of poetry. Keble humbly accepted the limits of religious knowledge, whilst hoping that the poet's faith could see the signs of the things hoped for in natural and human symbols, and evoke them through a sober metre. And in what may, for better or worse, be the first of several such instances today, I now quote some telling lines from Keble, in which old-fashioned natural theology, I think, and a more romantic and subjective tenor intermingle. These eyes, that dazzled now and weak, at glancing motes in sunshine wink, shall see the king's full glory break, nor from the blissful vision shrink. Newman, whose own religious poetry tended to dwell more on the inner spiritual combat of the subject than on the outward natural and sacramental objects which impressed themselves upon Keble's less conflicted imagination, described his friend's poems as teaching the truths which, as Newman said, I had learned from Butler. At the same time as feeling the attraction of Butler's probabilistic reasoning, however, and in some ways never escaping from it, Newman also resisted it, coming to feel that true faith required an indefectible certitude that could only be satisfied, ultimately, in Roman Catholicism. Keble regarded this leap as alien to Butler's wisdom, telling Newman, in a letter of June 1844, as his friend's doubts about the Church of England grew, that, as Keble wrote, "I've always fancied that perhaps you were over-sanguine in making things square, and did not quite allow enough for Bishop Butler's notion of doubt and intellectual difficulty being some men's intended element and appropriate trial." The permeating influence of Butler's philosophy would join poetic feeling in structuring how the two men interpreted the proper meaning and authority of the Church's past. Keble's and Newman's sustained studies of church history, especially of the Fathers, came later than their contact with poetics and with Butler, but were suffused by both. When Keble preached his assize sermon in the University Church on July 14, 1833, though a discourse prompted by the Whig government's proposal to abolish 10 Church of Ireland bishoprics, his aim was not primarily to issue a political rallying cry, but to encourage the Church to strengthen its own spiritual resources in an age when it could no longer rely on the government to support its claims. This demanded, in turn, the reassertion of the Church's independence from political control by means of the rediscovery of its apostolic tradition. And this emphasis fostered a growing preoccupation with the Church's history and its present-day relevance. Here, as Peter Nockels has pointed out, the High Churchmen, including Keble and Newman, who launched the Tracts for the Times in the same year and in this spirit, sought to do something more than reiterate Orthodox Anglicanism's traditional commitment to patristic divinity. A distinctively Anglican conception of orthodoxy, reliant on the Church Fathers as mediating and interpreting the supreme authority of Scripture, had first consolidated really during the 17th century in opposition to Puritan and Roman Catholic assaults. Traditionally textual in emphasis, pre-Tractarian High Churchmen typically treated the Fathers as providing proof texts for vindicating disputed points concerning the creeds or the 39 Articles, the Church of England's doctrinal statement, of course. Keble and Newman, however, invested the Fathers with a new kind of imaginative power, seeing them as living voices of devotional principle and practical religious life, as well as the custodians of a tradition of teaching that was independent of Scripture, if also authorised by it. In his contribution to the Tracts for the Times, entitled On the Mysticism Attributed to the Early Fathers of the Church, Keble defended his heroes against the Enlightenment-era charge that the Fathers were mystical, in the sense, alleged by deists, of being confused dreamers, remote from common sense and practical utility. Keble did accept, however, that they were mystical in the truer and higher sense that the Fathers employed poetical language, allegorising Scripture in order to communicate the unity and breadth of the historical fact of the divine economy in symbolic and reverential form, in a spirit which moderns should both admire and work to recapture. Newman also vibrated to just such a reading of the Fathers. In his 1833 study of the Arian heresy, which he dedicated to Keble, Newman posited the existence of a secret teaching among believers, given its outward form in the Church's creeds, and communicated by means of an allegorism intelligible only to the faithful, adumbrating, as Newman wrote, greater truths under the image of lesser. Though Newman and Keble shared a conception of the early Church which stressed its mystical and moral fidelity to revelation and higher authority over the improperly rationalizing or enthusiastic or unreserved theology of later times, the agreement concealed a growing chasm between them over where, properly, such reverence for the past ought to lead in the present day. From around 1843, a new and destabilizing word was playing on Newman's mind: development. In an instance of how Catholic sensibilities and the sense of historical loss which they cultivated could foster something like modern historical consciousness, Newman saw, more emphatically than Keble, that the Church of the first 3 centuries was not, in fact, the mirror image of the contemporary Church of England, as England's older standard divinity had assumed, but was rather another country. The early Church's teachings on crucial points of orthodoxy, such as the Trinity, had come to Newman to have been obscure or divided. Where then, Newman asked, had orthodoxy actually come from? And what authority, then, could presume to distinguish between orthodoxy and heterodoxy? Wrestling with these questions led Newman increasingly to accept that doctrine had, in fact, developed over time in the conscience of the Church, and that the process of development required an infallible authority, much more like the Roman Catholic Church than the allegedly factious and Erastian Church of England. In his 1845 essay on the development of Christian doctrine, which he dispatched to the printers shortly before his reception to the Roman Communion, Newman expanded this argument in full. One of its major buttresses was his reading of Joseph Butler's Analogy, which enabled him to argue that a developing authority in religion was inherently probable on the basis of what could be observed from nature and experience. Keble, by contrast, never drew back from the view that the early fathers had given voice to a shared and static orthodoxy, bequeathed to the Church of England through the General Councils, and maintained after the Reformation by her great divines. Keble was, in this sense at least, a more old-fashioned figure than Newman. Refusing at first even to read Newman's essay on development, by 1847 he felt able to make a critical reference to it in a long philosophical essay which he prefixed to his sermons Academical and Occasional. Arguing on the basis of Butler's philosophy that it was most reasonable to follow what he called the safest way in religion, Keble proposed that it would violate the moral principle of modesty to reject the church of one's birth, in his case the Church of England, and accept Rome's exclusive claims on the uncertain and contested basis of what he called a long and intricate discussion of the nature and proper force of theological development. As well as rejecting developmental understandings of doctrinal history, Keble remained committed, much more strongly and consistently than Newman, to thinking about his own position in relation to a certain kind of high church political theology, which placed great weight on the national church's role in English history. And this position inherently relied upon a fairly positive interpretation of Reformation and post-Reformation ecclesiastical history. Newman, voicing what was a strong current of Tractarian opinion, was, in addition to his reverence for the early church, also captivated by a Romantic-era medievalism, which extolled the Middle Ages as a period of pure faith, and which regretted the English Reformation for its assault on monasteries and church independence. As Newman mused in a poem of 1829, monks in the days of old lived in secret in the church's kindly sheltering fold, and so on. Keble, quite unusually among stronger Tractarians, kept a certain distance from this mode of thinking. In a sermon of 1838, he explained that during the Middle Ages, the church had begun to decline, both in unity and independence. It had been the English Reformation which, to his mind, had ultimately righted this wrong. The reformers under Henry VIII, Edward VI, and in the earlier years of Elizabeth's reign had, he conceded, shown too great a willingness to submit the church to civil authority, and had acted in too great a deference to those whom Keble disparaged as German reformers and foreign Presbyterians. At the end of the 16th century, nevertheless, it had been the genius of Richard Hooker, whose works Keble edited in an edition of 1841, to vindicate, in Keble's careful curation of the texts, the divine right of the Church of England's episcopate, its integration with the state, for as long as the latter upheld the independent laws of the Church, an important qualification, and the authority of Christian antiquity, confirming such doctrines as the real presence in the Eucharist against Puritan biblicists and the innovations of the papacy. As the 17th century ran on, and as Caroline Devines expanded upon Hooker's doctrines and corrected his occasional ambiguities, the true Catholicity of England's religious settlement, Keble considered, embedded itself in the life and practices of the wider nation. Elizabeth I, James I, and Charles I had all governed, in Keble's view, in the spirit of the Lord's prophecy to Zion in Isaiah, that kings shall be thy nursing fathers, and their queens thy nursing mothers. In homage to the religious duties of kings, and the Christian's obligation of passive obedience towards them, Keble revised the third edition of his Christian Year, published in 1828, to include meditations upon the so-called state services in the Book of Common Prayer, which marked the discovery of the Gunpowder Plot, the martyrdom of King Charles, and the restoration of the monarchy. In protecting the post-Reformation English Church, monarchs stood not so much in alliance with Parliament, which Keble seems always to have regarded as a roguish cabal, but in alliance with the laws and customs of England. In his assize sermon, preached of course before an audience of judges, Keble urged his hearers to remember the connections between what he called the Church and the law of England, embodied, as he said, in historical recollections, associations, and precedents of the most engaging and ennobling cast. In a pamphlet of 1850, in which he set out his opposition to the Privy Council's intrusion into judgments upon points touching Anglican doctrine, Keble argued that the Tudor Church had only ever accepted the doctrine of the royal supremacy, upon which the Privy Council's authority relied, on the understanding, which Henry and Elizabeth did not challenge, he said, that convocation would continue to meet, and that church courts would consist of orthodox judges. This was a trust, in Keble's view, which Parliament had betrayed with growing flagrancy since the 18th century. So in Keble's view, it was not he and his fellow Tractarians who sought to reverse England's Reformation settlement, but rather Erastian parliaments which did, by granting representation to dissenters and Roman Catholics, whilst increasingly interfering in the Church's doctrinal and constitutional autonomy. Considered altogether, Keble, in his scholarly and antiquarian cast of mind, his relatively conservative reading of Butler's philosophy, and his comparative closeness to the tradition of natural theology, stands out as rather closer to the conventional type of the 19th century high churchman than Newman ever was. Newman, hankering after experiential completeness rather than historical precedent, and more fully immersed in and publicly discursive concerning his inner self, was in some ways the more modern figure. And this helps to account, in part, I think, for the greater continuing attraction of Newman's writings compared to those of Keble. Undeniably backwards looking, there was one sense, however, in which Keble was also rather, I think, far-sighted. Although emotionally and religiously invested in the supposedly harmonious partnership between throne and altar established or secured at the Reformation, and saddened by its progressive disintegration, Keble was also, in his own way, one of the first Tractarians to face the new facts of life. Well before Gladstone came to the same recognition, Keble saw that it would not, in reality, be possible for the Church of England to claim to embody the religious nation, and so to claim exclusive political privilege on that basis. As early as 1833, Keble told Newman, in a striking comparison, that a reversal of what he called the state's anti-Christianity seems to me as unlikely as the Duke of Bedford restoring Tavistock Abbey. In the Age of Reform, somewhat later, or as the Age of Reform somewhat later came to Oxford, Keble accepted that the best that might be hoped for his kind of religious vision, would be the establishment of a centre for Tractarian learning within a newly pluralistic university open to dissenters and those of no particular belief. The questions Keble raised about how a religious movement which rejected secular liberalism could make its peace with a liberal polity, though they are today asked in a very different form, have not altogether gone away. And those questions have also ultimately had at least one happy issue here in the form of Keble College. Thank you very much.